The 2019 Methofest at Takwa, we present to you one of the past presiding bishops of the Methodist Church Ghana, our living legend, Most Reverend Robert Kwesi Abuaji Mensah. He will tell us a little bit about the autonomy that we are celebrating to coincide with the Methofest at Takwa.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, for all of us to reflect on our history today as we celebrate our autonomy. As you know, things like this do not just happen. There are a lot of processes that had to take place before this was possible. Interestingly, historically, it was in from April 26 to April 6, 1954, that the British, all this time, we were all under, all the churches, Methodist churches in the West Africa, were all under the British. But on this date, there was a meeting which took place in Ibadan. That is April 26 to May 6, 1954. To discuss issues that had a common concern for all of us. And part of it was, how do we become an autonomous church, thinking about our own issues and so on. This was not a conference, and in some way not even a synod as such. It was just representatives that were concerned about issues, and the discussion included some British also, Methodists who were around. So at that meeting, there are certain recommendations were made. Some of the recommendation was that we asked all these synods, or asked the British Conference to grant some kind of autonomy to the West African Methodist communities, which for most people thought was very helpful. And this was addressed to the British Conference. But it could not be accepted until, because this was, as I said, the body that met in this period to discuss this issue wasn't the synod. So on 1955, they had each member church from West African countries, like the Methodist Church in the Gambia, the Methodist Church in Sierra Leone, the Methodist Church in Ghana, and then two other Methodist churches in Nigeria in those days, were to have their own synods and vote before it could go to a conference. And interestingly, in 1955, when Ghana voted on that issue, we found that 146 of the members who were present at that synod voted for it. There was one person who voted against, and then there were 7 that were neutral, or they didn't have a kind of, they abstained from whatever was going on. So you find that the idea was overwhelmingly accepted by the Methodist Synod. And that was preparing us now as a Methodist church for this. This is the Synod decision. We were still under the British. And so it had to go to conference, or certain things have to take place for the whole matter to go to conference before British this. Conference. Yes, the British conference, for this to take place before we could become autonomous. And that's also very important for us as a Methodist Church Ghana, as well as for the British conference. And interestingly and happily, this actually took place, just to cut the long story short. What happened was that favorable date that we all remember, the 28th of July, 1961. That day was a Friday, and the place that these documents were actually signed was nowhere, obviously, has to be the Cape Coast Church, Wesley Church in Cape Coast. That's where it was signed at 2:30 p.m. And when it was actually signed, remember, this didn't even happen under a synod, because that's the date one. And then later, On the 31st of July, then there was a real kind of a conference, representatives and so on from that synod from British that we actually signed we actually adopted. It was first signed in Cape Coast and then adopted in the same place on 31st July 1961. And that is partly a brief history about how we came to do that.
How was the voting at that regime?
No, that part, it was a standing, those who needed, it was just a standing vote on the 31st July. It was a standing vote. So everybody got up and we all accepted.
And who signed on behalf of?
The one who signed on behalf of us, of course, was that time the president of the Methodist Church. Today we will say the presiding bishop. But that time the president of the Methodist Church, Ghana, that was Pa Grant, CFC Grant. He was the one who signed on behalf of the Methodist Church.
So from then, what became, were there any advantages to us?
Yes, there were some advantages, but I think it would be important. I mean, when we discussed this issue, there were certain decisions that were taken. How do we go about our churches and so on? And there were some important things like what should be the relationship between, say, the Methodist Church Ghana and the British Methodists and other Methodist communities within the West Africa or in the world as a whole. And these things were so important that we felt they actually put some of these things down for future reflections. And I just want to go through with you, just skimming through to find out one or two of them that were very important to us. One of them was that the British recognized that all these churches in the West Africa are mature churches now, who can run their own business, that they do not necessarily need the British conformity or to do anything. And that was very important. It means that if the Methodist Church Ghana takes its decision as a conference, then it means it doesn't apply to other Methodist churches outside, because we are a mature church. The other was the recognition that even though we have become autonomous, we still need to maintain a partnership among ourselves as Methodist churches in the region as well as in Britain. But that partnership does not mean that whatever the other one's decision they take, it affects the others. No. Each conference is autonomous. You take your own decision. It doesn't affect the others.
In the light of the present situation, what would you say?
In fact, that is where you just made a point. That's why I'm stressing that. I heard someone on the, they send on this WhatsApp, said something about some person, I don't know the person's name, who was more or less castigating the Methodist Church, thinking that the Methodist Church Ghana too has more or less yielded to the decision of the British Conference about the same-sex marriage or lesbianism or homosexual, whatever term you want to use. The Methodist Church does not have that. Since we are a conference, the decision that the British Methodist Conference takes doesn't affect us. We may be present, as is usually the case. I mean, if you like, I can share a very interesting story with you.
Come on, go ahead.
When I was the presiding bishop, I attended the Methodist Conference. And that day, when the day that they were going to discuss issues about same-sex marriages, interestingly, all of us who were from the foreign countries, like Ghana, Sierra Leone, even Asia and so on, we were all sent on an excursion. Because they thought it's a sensitive issue, they want to discuss it on their own. and take their own decision. It was after we came back and the excursion was over, the conference announced their decision. Okay? So whatever decision that the British conference are taking about same-sex marriage doesn't apply to Methodist Church Ghana in any way. We have every right to stand against it, and we will. In fact, in the Methodist Church Ghana, at one or two of our conferences, we said that for us, this is not an issue on the agenda for discussion. It's a European issue. The Europeans are concerned about same-sex, not, and we, going by our biblical stand, do not think that God has changed his mind. And we are more committed to what God has said in his scriptures than what any other church takes. They have taken their own decision. It doesn't affect us, and it will not affect us and I see it as Methodist Church Ghana.
Okay. What are some of the other
issues? The other was the question of, in those days, one of the things that actually mooted the whole idea of autonomy, one of them, not this, was that it was, if you like, was more of a political matter. In the sense that Ghana was, in Africa, countries were fighting to be independent. And in 1957, Ghana was becoming independent. And by being under the British conference in those days meant that all the properties that we own in Ghana are also under the British. They own it. There's a British Methodist conference that owned the properties that we had. And that was going to create a big problem for the church. How can we become independent as a nation, and the church, Methodist Church Ghana, is under the British Methodist Church, and its properties and so on owned by the British? And that's also one of the things that motivated the Methodist Church Ghana and the other Methodist communities on the West Africa also to become fighting for their autonomy. Unfortunately, as I said, on that date that we signed that document, or Power Grant signed on our behalf, on the 31st of July by conference, then that kind of idea did not exist anymore. We were autonomous. But they were also talking about cooperation. That's what I said about partnership. And interesting, in those days, the decision that was taken that the British will raise about, say, £1 million, and the 6 or so synods, which are now, some of them become a conference, will also raise £3 million. They put it together as a way of running the Methodist Church on in the sub-region, that's West Africa, and so on. But those are part, and so certain financial commitment also was part of our commitment in becoming autonomous. It's very interesting here that met me out, and we appreciate what our forefathers, Power Grant and others, the decision they took. One of the questions was whether when we become independent, autonomous, we will still want the British to financially, as it were, control and contribute highly towards the running of Methodist Church. And I'm glad and happy to say our forefathers said that no, becoming financially dependent is part also of our being autonomous church. So that's how we started then find out how we can run our church, paying our ministers, because the British were then thinking of paying even our ministers from Britain. And if your ministers and so on are paid from Britain, where is your independence? And your autonomy in that sense. So I'm happy, I'm very proud that our forefathers took that decision on our behalf. And since the Methodist Church. And I'm also praying that the day will come when we'll be fully autonomous in that. We're still working. So that if nobody uses money as a way of intimidating us. Because now that we are going to say or have said no to homosexuality and so on, if we are still financially dependent on Britain, I'm very sure they will tell you they cannot send us money. We must make sure that our autonomy is also financial autonomy We must maintain what our forefathers did. And it is not impossible. It is possible.
People, it's good we have this explanation. Because people have always been comparing our church to the Catholic Church, for instance.
Yes.
And talk about the inflow of financing from outside. But we don't have to do that because we are totally independent.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I don't know much about the Catholic Church, so I don't want to make any statement. But as you said, they have a central place, the Pope, and so on, everything connected there, so they can get support and so on. But we, in some ways, are independent in that sense, or we are autonomous. And financial, as we have said, standing on our feet financially is one of the ways of maintaining that by God's grace, we are also a mature church. You see, dependence doesn't help anybody. And I wish that, I mean, I don't want to go into any other details about other churches. I won't mention any church. But there are other churches that are financially dependent. And I know some churches in Ghana, setting an example for the world, where if you're a minister and you ask for money from outside for many organization, you can be kicked out of the ministry. Because they believe that the Lord can provide through them. And indeed, the Lord has and continues to provide. And I'm looking forward to something like that. We are in that. We are that. But we can go beyond that so that we don't allow anybody to intimidate us with money. You know, because the decision that the British Methodists have taken, United Methodist Church in U.S., I won't be surprised if they have not even already taken this decision. And they will intimidate you if you go there and ask them for money. But I'm sure, by God's grace, if we think hard and work hard, we don't want to become financially dependent. If anything at all, we do it as a respect for each other, not because we are submitting ourselves. And we're hoping that will reflect on the nations of Africa too.
In keeping with being autonomous and therefore dependent on us, our bishop, the Right Reverend Professor Ejisa Eison, has introduced a new program called Club 1000 for members of the church to contribute towards the development of the church. And this is one example of doing something on our own without depending on somebody from outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think it's a good idea, and we hope that some people will voluntarily come up and contribute towards sustaining the church. The new diocese, North Accra Diocese. So we pray for you that it works.
Thank you.
Thank you.